This video is all about binoculars and why you should invest in a pair of binoculars for your astronomy needs, especially if you're a beginner amateur astronomer. I say that because binoculars do have a purpose and they're actually amazing pieces of equipment that you should have. The reason I say this, and I'm going to be explaining this from a non technical point of view, so I'm not going to really get into the technical aspects of binoculars. But I say all this because the biggest reason as to why binoculars are beneficial to you is they are light and they can fit in the palm of your hand. And when it comes to astronomy, having something that's quick, easy to use, and involves very little setup is beneficial to your astronomy needs. All right, it looks like a good day to go observing the sun, or better yet, since it's evening, let me go out now and set up for some night viewing. So now let me get my battery pack. Let me get my telescope. Let me get my cameras. Do I really want to carry all this to the car, drive out to a field, set it all up, and then either clouds come in or lugging it back or figuring out what to do in case something happens? Do I really feel, or I'm really just tired, I've been working out and now I just don't feel like doing it? I know, I can just, instead of doing all that, I don't feel like doing all this tonight. I just want to go out and do something relatively quick that can be almost as effective. And what I can do is just go get my binoculars. And now I can go out and observe, do it quickly, see what I want to see, and be back in my house or back in my apartment. That is the biggest benefit of binoculars. Now, you do lose something as it relates to astronomy. There's always a catch. There's always pros and cons to everything. So you do lose things when using binoculars as opposed to an actual telescope. But one of the biggest things in astronomy is a telescope is not any good to you if you don't use it. And in many instances, you don't have the time to always go out there, lug your equipment to your car or lug your equipment to the train, go to a location, set it up, then observe what you want to observe, take everything apart and lug it back, especially if you're not doing astrophotography, because many of the times the things you want to see will only take a few minutes for you to look at anyway, and then you'll have to set everything, break everything back down, lug everything. You don't want to do that all the time. Sometimes you do want to do that, but in many instances, especially if the weather's cold or if it's extremely hot, you don't want to do that all the time. You just want to go out, observe what you want to observe, and then go back to where you do what you want to do. And in that instance, binoculars are very beneficial, and they're also helpful in having you locate stuff, so you can find stuff in the sky relatively quickly, and then point your telescope toward it. What's the deal about binoculars? Well, the good thing about binoculars is that they are in essence two telescopes in the palm of your hand, and they function as such. But when it comes to binoculars, there's obviously a difference between binoculars and an actual a larger telescope that you would use for astronomy. Larger telescopes have more aperture, which means they can gather more light. But binoculars while they might not be able to have as large a field of view, as great a magnification, or as large an aperture. An aperture simply means the lens's ability to accumulate light. Imagine it as uh, imagine it as a cup of water. Or a cup. A cup can gather only so much water. But if you get a larger cup, let's say you go to a bucket, you can gather more water. And then you can go to a tub, which gathers more water. Where aperture basically functions the same way. The smaller the aperture, the less light you can get. You can accumulate. As the aperture goes up, you can gather more and more light, which means you can get more resolution to your image. The downside to that is you need a larger and larger telescope. So therefore, these binoculars, or this pair of binoculars, has a 50 millimeter aperture, which is, as you can see, isn't very big. But if you go to this telescope, which is my next star telescope, this is 8 inches, which can gather much more light. But as you can see, the downside, it's a much larger telescope, and it's not as portable as my pair of binoculars. But the good news is that when it comes to light, if you're in an area that has a lot of light, then aperture, you can get good images regardless of the size of your aperture, which makes binoculars pretty good, especially if you live in a place, or go to a place that has low light pollution. You can see more of the sky even with your naked eye, and binoculars will just enhance the image. Now, what if you're interested in binoculars? How do you go about getting a pair? Well, the thing about binoculars are that there are many sizes of binoculars. There are sizes which I like, which fit in the palm of my hand, to binoculars that you actually have to get a mount for. Those are the ones, unless you, to me, pretty much defeat the purpose of binoculars, because I can just get a telescope. But some astronomers like binoculars for that, for just like binoculars that large. But I say that if you're a beginner, get a pair that's manageable, because the old adage in astronomy is a telescope is only as good as how often you use it. And usually you want something quick, easy, something you can use and use often. And then as you get more advanced, then you start going up and determining what you actually like. So how do you go about finding a pair of binoculars? Well, binoculars function just like any other telescope, in that there are some standards for what you want. You want something that has a good amount of aperture so that you will be able to gather light when you go out to the night sky, has a decent amount of magnification, but also will not, how should I say, waste light, which goes into the exit pupil. Now, I know this is supposed to be not technical, but if you're getting to this point of the video, obviously you're interested in binoculars. I want to make sure you get a good pair of binoculars. So this pair is a pretty good pair. If you see here, you will see 7x50. So what that means is the 7x is the magnification. And you usually want a magnification between 5 and maybe around 12, because that will later play into the exit pupil. The 50 is the aperture. That's how much light both lenses can gather. The aperture basically is the diameter. So this is a 50. This pair of binoculars has a 50 millimeter aperture. Now, you might be like, well, I want as large an aperture as possible. Well, you have to think about that. What I showed previously was my telescope, one of my telescopes. That is an 8-inch aperture. And therefore, as you can see, if you want more aperture, the lens gets bigger. And that defeats the, so you have to factor in, if you get something with a large aperture, a larger aperture, can you hold the pair of binoculars without getting them out? But getting them out defeats the purpose. Therefore, you want something that you can hold. 50 millimeters is a good starting point. For astronomy, a 50 millimeter pair of binoculars provides you all the aperture you need. And if you feel like you want to go further up, then do that. But 50 millimeters is pretty good. The reason I say you have to factor that, you have to think about aperture, is because astronomy is all about light. And at the end of the day, your eyes have to be able to absorb that light so you can see an image. And therefore, that's what's known as the exit pupil. Is that how, basically it's how your pupils adjust to the night sky and how much light that they can absorb. And most young adults or younger, have an exit pupil of around 7 millimeters. And you can calculate the exit pupil by simply taking the aperture and divide it by the magnification. That gets you around 7. As you get older, that exit pupil for most adults goes around 5. And therefore you have to calculate that, because if you get a pair of binoculars that has a greater exit pupil than your eyes can't absorb, or will not absorb, the additional light. And you're in essence wasting light. So the image that you see will not be as great as it could have been if you got a pair that fits your exit pupil. But that's more or less a guide. And therefore, when looking at binoculars, keep that in mind. Now, if you see right here, it says field. That in essence is the field of view. Basically what that is when you look through the telescope, that's how wide the field of view is. And for the most part, you want a large field of view, especially when you're looking at galaxies or nebulas. You want as large a field of view as possible. Now, my personal opinion is when it comes to planets, you might want a smaller field of view, but it depends. But as you go through astronomy, but that's my personal preference. But as you go through astronomy, you will more or less begin to figure out what you like, what you want to observe, how you want to observe them, and then you can make adequate purchases as such, which is another benefit to binoculars. Binoculars are not as expensive as telescopes. And therefore, if you're just, well, I'm not really interested in astronomy. I'm interested, but I don't want to make a huge investment. I don't want to get all the equipment, but I still, if the night is clear, want to go out and observe, then binoculars are a huge tool to add or even begin your equipment in astronomy. I really enjoy binoculars. I really feel like that they are beneficial to your equipment, regardless of whether you have telescope like I do, or this is your first piece of equipment. They are extremely versatile. You can observe anything with them. You can observe galaxies. You can observe nebulas. You can observe planets. You can even observe the sun. And I feel as though you will be able to get your money's worth out of a good, decent pair. Well, that is the video, and if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments, and feel free to like and subscribe.